What happens when a renowned liberal professor, known for her sharp intellect and even sharper political views, decides to publicly challenge a student she assumes is just another privileged name? What if that student turns out to be a mathematical prodigy, one whose brilliance will soon leave an entire classroom? And even the professor herself, in stunned silence? Trust me, by the end of this story, you won't believe what unfolded in that lecture hall. It happened at one of America's most prestigious universities, a place where the brightest minds gathered to push the limits of knowledge. In an advanced calculus class taught by Dr. Linda Markham, a professor celebrated for her expertise in mathematical theory but equally infamous for weaving her strong political opinions into her lectures, students prepared for what was expected to be another intellectually rigorous session. Dr. Markham's name commanded respect, and her reputation preceded her. While no one doubted her mathematical brilliance, many had noticed a shift in her teaching over the years. Increasingly, numbers and equations took a backseat to ideological discussions, and today was shaping up to be no different. As students filtered into the grand lecture hall, they quickly noticed something unusual. The massive whiteboard, typically covered in intricate formulas and integrals, instead displayed a simple phrase, redefining academic priorities. A murmur rippled through the room. Some students exchanged uneasy glances, already anticipating what was coming. Others simply sighed, resigning themselves to yet another lecture that had little to do with calculus. Sitting quietly in the back of the room was a tall, composed young man in a perfectly pressed black suit. Few of his classmates knew him personally. He was polite but private, preferring solitude over socializing. But while they might not have known him well, everyone in the room knew who he was. Barron Trump. The name alone carried weight, often more than he wanted. Most assumed he was there because of his last name, a product of privilege rather than personal achievement. What they didn't know, what none of them could have possibly guessed, was that behind his reserved demeanor lay a mathematical mind unlike any they had ever encountered. And on this day, in this lecture hall, that mind was about to be tested in a way no one saw coming. Dr. Markham strode confidently to the front of the room, the click of her heels echoing against the tiled floors of the massive lecture hall. The whiteboard behind her still bore the words redefining academic priorities, a phrase that left many students shifting uncomfortably in their seats. But for those who had taken her class before, this was nothing new. She adjusted her glasses, scanning the room with a knowing smirk before beginning. Mathematics, she said, drawing out the word like it was an afterthought, is an important tool, but one that cannot be studied in a vacuum. In today's world, we must acknowledge that numbers, formulas, and theories exist within a greater societal framework, one shaped by privilege, inequality, and historical injustice. A few students exchanged glances, while others leaned back, already familiar with where this was going. Dr. Markham continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had long since made up her mind. STEM fields, particularly mathematics, have long been dominated by a particular demographic. And let's be honest, many of you in this room are here not solely because of merit, but because of advantages you were born into. Family wealth, access to private tutors, the best prep schools. Her eyes drifted across the lecture hall before landing, almost deliberately, on Barron Trump. Some of you, she said pointedly, may need to accept that your position in this class is not a reflection of superior ability, but of circumstances far beyond your control. A few murmurs rippled through the class. Some students nodded in agreement, while others stiffened. But in the back of the room, Barron Trump remained completely composed. He had heard it all before. The assumptions, the judgments, the belief that he was nothing more than the product of his last name. But what Dr. Markham didn't realize, what no one in that room realized, was that today, she was about to make a grave mistake. Barron slowly raised his hand. At first, Dr. Markham ignored him. She clicked to the next slide on her PowerPoint, displaying a set of statistics on gender and racial disparities in STEM fields. Research shows, she continued, that representation in these fields remains disproportionately skewed. And yet, those who benefit from this imbalance are often the least willing to acknowledge it. Barron's hand remained raised, steady, patient. A few students turned in their seats, some glancing back at him with curiosity, others with amusement. They had seen him sit through entire lectures without saying a word, Why speak up now? Still, Dr. Markham persisted, moving through her slides, deliberately avoiding his gaze. For example, she went on, family connections and wealth often create artificial advantages in education. This is why some students find themselves in advanced courses, even when others may be more deserving of those seats. The implication was clear. The silence in the room grew heavier. Barron's hand never wavered. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dr. Markham could no longer ignore him. With an exaggerated sigh, she folded her arms and arched a brow. "Yes, Mr. Trump?" she asked, her voice laced with amusement and irritation. "Do you have something to contribute to our discussion on privilege and education?" The entire room fell silent. Barron lowered his hand slowly. His expression remained composed, his voice calm, measured. "Dr. Markham," he said, "I believe calculus is fundamental to understanding both theoretical and applied sciences. Many of us chose this advanced class specifically to deepen our mathematical knowledge." He paused, then added, "Wouldn't reducing the core curriculum potentially disadvantage all students, regardless of their background?" A few students nodded subtly, agreeing with his point. Dr. Markham's expression hardened. "Mr. Trump," she repeated, emphasizing his last name with a sharp edge. "Perhaps you, of all people, could benefit the most from understanding how privilege shapes our educational system. After all, not everyone had access to elite prep schools and private tutors." What happened next surprised everyone. Instead of becoming defensive, Barron simply smiled. "You're right about one thing, Professor," he said, his tone as steady as ever. "I have been fortunate in my education. That's precisely why I believe we have a responsibility to maintain high academic standards, so that everyone can reach their full potential, regardless of background." The professor's face flushed slightly. This wasn't the reaction she had expected. Her jaw tightened. "And you think you know better than your professor about maintaining academic standards?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Tell me, Mr. Trump, what makes you such an expert on mathematical education?" Barron didn't hesitate. "I'm not claiming to be an expert," he replied simply. "I'm just a student who loves mathematics and believes in its power to transcend political divisions." He gestured toward the whiteboard, which remained untouched by any actual math. Instead of debating privilege, he added, "Couldn't we spend this time exploring the beautiful complexities of calculus?" For the first time that morning, the room felt alive. A few students leaned forward, intrigued. Others exchanged glances. Their interest piqued. Dr. Markham's eyes narrowed. She walked slowly to the whiteboard, marker in hand. "Very well, Mr. Trump," she said, her smirk returning. "Since you're so passionate about mathematics, let's put that passion to the test." She turned to the board and began writing. Her hand moved quickly, crafting an equation that made several students gasp. Even the most confident students in the room felt their stomachs sink. This wasn't just any calculus problem. This was the kind of complex integration that even graduate students would struggle with. She stepped back, satisfied. "Since you're so concerned about maintaining standards," she said with a smirk, "why don't you show us how it's done? Unless, of course, you'd prefer to discuss your privileged background instead." The challenge hung in the air. Several students shifted uncomfortably, recognizing this as a clear attempt at public humiliation. One student even muttered, "That's graduate-level stuff." But Barron's expression remained unchanged. His composure? Unwavering. "Of course," he said quietly, standing up, "I'd be happy to try." As he walked toward the front of the room, Dr. Markham's smirk widened. She had chosen this problem specifically because it required techniques she hadn't yet taught. Techniques that went far beyond the scope of their current coursework. But something in Barron's calm demeanor made her smile falter slightly. He took the marker she offered, studying the equation with genuine interest rather than the fear she had expected. A few students leaned forward in their seats, sensing that something unexpected was about to happen. Barron turned to the class. "Before I begin," he said, his voice calm, confident, "I noticed this problem has multiple possible approaches. Would you prefer I use the standard method? Or would you be interested in seeing a more efficient solution I learned while studying Leibniz's original papers?" Dr. Markham's expression froze. The casual reference to Leibniz's work caught her off guard. "You've read Leibniz's original papers?" she asked. unable to hide her surprise. Yes, Barron replied simply. In German, the translations don't quite capture the elegance of his methodology. He turned back to the board. Marker poised. But perhaps we should let the mathematics speak for itself. And then, with practiced precision, he began writing. The silence in the room deepened. What happened next would change everything. Barron Trump stood before the massive whiteboard. The marker poised in his hand, eyes calmly scanning the complex equation Dr. Markham had thrown at him. The room held its breath. The problem sprawled across the board was no ordinary calculus exercise. It was graduate-level mathematics. The kind of problem designed to make even the brightest students falter. But Barron wasn't just any student. Dr. Markham folded her arms. Smirking slightly, she had chosen this equation deliberately, expecting Barron to hesitate, to struggle, to prove the very point she had been making about privilege versus merit. The problem required techniques she hadn't taught, methods only those with extensive mathematical knowledge or self-driven intellectual discipline could solve. Barron, however, did not hesitate. Interesting choice, he mused, tilting his head slightly. This problem has multiple valid solutions. Would you prefer I use the traditional approach? Or shall I demonstrate a more elegant method inspired by Euler's 1755 derivations? The room went still. Dr. Markham blinked. A few students exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from amusement to genuine curiosity. You've studied Euler's original works? She asked, her voice betraying the slightest hint of disbelief. In their original language, Barron replied smoothly. The English translations miss some of the subtleties in his reasoning. A murmur spread through the lecture hall. Some students pulled out their phones, recording discreetly, sensing they were about to witness something remarkable. Dr. Markham clenched her jaw. Well, then, she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. By all means, let the mathematics speak for itself. Barron nodded, then turned back to the whiteboard. With deliberate, precise strokes, he began writing. Step by step, his solution unfolded. Each movement of his marker was controlled, elegant, revealing a clarity of thought far beyond his years. He worked swiftly, but not carelessly. Each step was explained, not just solved but deconstructed, as if he were teaching rather than merely answering. This first step, he said, his voice calm and unwavering, utilizes a reduction technique first proposed by Lagrange. It allows us to simplify the integral without unnecessary expansion. Several students leaned forward, their skepticism dissolving into genuine intrigue. Dr. Markham's confident smirk was beginning to fade. Barron continued, barely pausing as he filled the board with structured equations. You see, this expression may appear cumbersome, he said, glancing briefly at the class. But by applying a variation of the Leibniz integral rule, he circled a portion of the equation and rewrote it in a much simpler form. We reduce it significantly. A student in the second row muttered, "Holy crap." Another whispered, "I barely understand what he's doing. But it makes sense." Dr. Markham's eyes narrowed. This wasn't supposed to be happening. Barron was supposed to struggle. He was supposed to fumble, to hesitate. Instead, he was teaching the class better than she had. And then came the moment that shifted everything. Barron reached the crucial step in the solution and turned to Dr. Markham. Now, he said, we have two possible paths forward. The standard method would require a full additional board to expand and simplify this integral. He pointed to an alternate transformation on the side. But if we apply a technique from Laplace's early work, we can bypass that entirely. Would you prefer the conventional method or the more efficient approach? Professor? Silence. Dr. Markham did not answer. For the first time that morning, she seemed unsure. Barron held her gaze for a second longer before continuing. Let's go with efficiency, he decided. After all, maintaining high academic standards means valuing mathematical beauty as much as rigor. His marker moved again. Within a few more lines, the once imposing, monstrous equation had been transformed into a simple, elegant result. And then, just like that, it was done. Barron placed the cap back on the marker, set it down on the ledge of the whiteboard, and turned to face the class. This, he said, gesturing toward the final answer, is the power of calculus when applied correctly. The room erupted. A handful of students clapped instinctively. Others sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed. One student in the front row whispered, "That was insane." Another leaned over to his friend, whispering, "Did you record that?" Dr. Markham stood frozen, her face betraying the internal battle raging in her mind. She was trapped. If she tried to discredit his solution, she would need to prove an error, and there was none. Every step had been flawless. Every theorem applied with absolute precision. For the first time in her career, she had been intellectually outmaneuvered by a student. Barron, however, was not finished. He turned back to the class, his voice as steady as ever. "There's something important to take away from this," he said. "Mathematics is not political. It is not shaped by ideology. It does not care about our biases. It only seeks truth." A few students nodded slowly, absorbing his words. Dr. Markham's fingers curled slightly at her sides. "Are you implying that I am biased, Mr. Trump?" she asked, her voice sharp. Barron met her gaze with calm, unwavering confidence. "I'm implying that truth should never be sacrificed for ideology," he replied. The tension in the room was electric. Dr. Markham opened her mouth, as if to argue, but before she could speak, something unexpected happened. A hand shot up in the middle of the class. It was Sarah Chen, one of the quieter students. "Professor," she said hesitantly, could we go over both methods again? What Barron just did actually helped me understand last week's topic a lot better." Barron turned to her, offering a small nod. Of course. The class wasn't just impressed, they wanted to learn from him. Dr. Markham's lips pressed into a thin line. This was not the way she had expected this lesson to go. And then, as if fate had a sense of irony, the classroom door burst open. Dean Richardson strode in, his expression unreadable. "Linda," he said to Dr. Markham, "we need you for an emergency faculty meeting regarding the new curriculum changes." The timing couldn't have been worse. Or, from Dr. Markham's perspective, perhaps it couldn't have been better. She turned back to the class, forcing an air of control back into her voice. "We'll have to continue this another time," she announced. But Barron wasn't about to let her walk away that easily. "Professor," he said, stopping her mid-step, "you challenged me to solve this problem in front of the class. Walking away now would send an unfortunate message about academic integrity, wouldn't it?" The class erupted in murmurs. A few students nodded in agreement. Others turned to Dr. Markham, waiting for her response. The dean stiffened, sensing that this was no longer just a classroom dispute, it was becoming a defining moment. Dr. Markham hesitated, and that's when Barron did something truly remarkable. He reached down, picked up the marker, and held it out to her. "Or," he said, his voice steady, "perhaps you'd prefer to show us your solution instead." The silence that followed was deafening. For a full 5 seconds, no one moved, no one spoke. Dr. Markham stared at the marker in his hand. She knew the truth. She couldn't solve it. Not here, not now, not under these circumstances. Her hand clenched into a fist at her side. And then, without another word, she turned and walked away. The class erupted, and at that moment, one thing became undeniably clear. Barron Trump had just made history in that lecture hall. Dean Richardson stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes darting between Barron Trump, the stunned students, and Dr. Markham, whose rigid posture betrayed the turmoil beneath her composed exterior. The tension in the room was so thick it could be cut with a knife. The dean had entered the classroom expecting to control the damage, to offer a quick distraction and allow Dr. Markham to retreat before the situation spiraled further. But it was too late for that. The class had just witnessed something unprecedented. A professor had attempted to publicly humiliate a student, only to be intellectually outmaneuvered in front of the entire room. And now, all eyes were on him. "Dr. Markham," he said carefully, stepping forward, his tone measured but firm. "Perhaps it would be best if we—" Barron's voice, calm but unyielding, cut through the room before the dean could finish. "Dean Richardson," Barron said, addressing him directly, "with all due respect, the lesson isn't finished." A wave of murmurs swept through the class. Dr. Markham turned sharply to face Barron, her eyes narrowing. "Mr. Trump, this conversation is over." Barron didn't flinch. He simply looked at her, his gaze steady but free of hostility. "With all due respect, Professor," he said evenly, We are in an advanced calculus class. Shouldn't our time be spent studying mathematics? A few students smirked. Others nodded subtly, recognizing the irony of Barron's statement. Dean Richardson shifted uncomfortably. The last thing he wanted was for this to turn into a spectacle beyond the walls of this classroom. But judging by the discreet glow of phone screens still recording, it was already too late. He cleared his throat. Mr. Trump, I appreciate your enthusiasm for maintaining academic rigor, he said, choosing his words carefully, but Dr. Markham is needed at a faculty meeting. Barron didn't back down. Then perhaps before she leaves, he said, she could acknowledge what has just taken place here. Dr. Markham stiffened. Her reputation, built over years of academic prestige and intellectual dominance, was unraveling before her very eyes. She had spent years weaving her ideology into her lessons, subtly shaping the way students perceived privilege, merit, and education. But today, the very assumptions she built her philosophy upon had been dismantled in real time, and not by another professor. By a student. By Barron Trump. Dean Richardson glanced at her, then at the class. The entire room was waiting. A lesser educator might have lashed out, doubled down, tried to salvage authority by asserting dominance. But Markham, for all her faults, was not a fool. She could see the shift in her students' faces. The admiration for Barron, the realization that they had just learned more about calculus in the past 10 minutes than they had in weeks. And then, something no one expected happened. Dr. Markham exhaled. She turned back to the board, eyes scanning the flawless proof Barron had just completed. Her fingers twitched slightly at her sides, as if resisting the urge to pick up the marker and make corrections that simply weren't there. She turned back to Barron. You handled that problem well, she admitted slowly, her voice quieter now. Exceptionally well. A ripple of disbelief ran through the class. Barron simply nodded, offering nothing but professional courtesy in return. Thank you, Professor. Dr. Markham hesitated. Then, as if coming to terms with the inevitable, she turned to the class. She began, choosing her words with care. I have spent much of my career emphasizing the context of education, the way privilege and access shape learning. She glanced briefly at Barron before continuing. But today, I was reminded of something fundamental. She turned back to the board, gesturing toward the elegant solution Barron had written. Mathematics does not care who you are, she said, it only cares about truth. Silence. The weight of her words hung in the air. Then, from the back of the room, a single clap, then another, and then, before anyone could fully process what had just happened, the entire class erupted into applause. For a moment, Dr. Markham simply stood there, absorbing it all. Then, without another word, she nodded at the dean and walked toward the door. But before she stepped out, she turned back. Mr. Trump, she said. Barron looked up. She hesitated. Then, with a faint smirk, she said, I'll see you in class next week. And with that, she was gone. What happened in that classroom did not stay in that classroom. By the time Barron had returned to his seat, at least 5 different versions of the video had already made their way onto social media. Within hours, the clip of him flawlessly dismantling a graduate-level calculus problem was trending. The comments flooded in. Holy crap, I would kill to have a classmate like Barron. Imagine trying to humble someone and getting completely destroyed instead. Not gonna lie, I'd rather learn from Barron than the professor. By the next day, news outlets had picked up the story. Barron Trump outsmarts professor in heated classroom debate. Calculus showdown. How a quiet student silenced the lecturer. Genius or just prepared? What Barron Trump's viral classroom moment teaches us about education. Within a week, enrollment in Dr. Markham's class had tripled. Some students wanted to see if the rumors were true. Others genuinely wanted to be in the same class as Barron. But the most unexpected development? Dr. Markham changed. No longer were her lectures thinly veiled political discussions. She taught math, and she taught it well. And Barron? He still sat in the back of the class. He still rarely spoke, but now, when he did, everyone listened. And after every lecture, students gathered around him, asking for help, seeking his insights. And he helped them. Because in the end, it was never about proving himself to a professor. It was about proving that education should be about merit, about skill, About knowledge, not ideology, not assumptions, and definitely not politics. And in that single, legendary moment, Barron Trump reminded an entire university what real learning looked like. The story of what unfolded in Dr. Markham's calculus class didn't just remain an isolated incident. It became a defining moment that spread across campus, the academic world, and even mainstream media. For days, the university buzzed with discussions about what had happened. Students who had never taken an interest in calculus suddenly found themselves watching and rewatching the viral clip of Barron Trump effortlessly solving a problem that had left even the professor speechless. But this wasn't just about one student proving a point. This was about something much bigger. This was about the true purpose of education and how, for too long, that purpose had been clouded by politics, ideology, and preconceived biases. And on that day, in that one classroom, a single student had cut through all of it with nothing more than logic, skill, and an unshakable belief in the power of knowledge. In the weeks that followed, the effects of that classroom confrontation only grew stronger. For one, Dr. Markham changed. Gone were the politicized tangents that once dominated her lectures. Gone were the thinly veiled implications about privilege and who truly belonged in her class. Instead, she did what she had once been best at: she taught math. And while she never openly addressed what had happened that day, those who paid attention could see the shift. She lectured with renewed focus, her lessons finally returning to the subject that mattered. And while some students still regarded her with skepticism, something remarkable happened. More students began to respect her again. Because in the end, it wasn't about who had won or lost that debate, it was about what had been gained. And no one had gained more than the students themselves. As for Barron, if you were expecting him to gloat, to capitalize on his newfound fame, to weaponize his intellect for status, you'd be disappointed. Because he did none of those things. He still sat in the back of the classroom, quietly taking notes. He still rarely spoke unless called upon. And when students approached him after class, not for an autograph or a picture, but for help with their coursework, he never turned them away. Because to Barron, this had never been about proving himself. It had always been about one thing, and one thing only: learning. And that's why, when students from other courses began attending Dr. Markham's lectures, not because they were enrolled, but because they wanted to learn from the same classroom where Barron Trump studied, he didn't see it as admiration. He saw it as proof. Proof that when you remove the bias, the assumptions, the politics, and leave behind only knowledge, people will always be drawn to it. Because knowledge is powerful, but only when it's unbiased, pure, and accessible to all. This story isn't just about Barron Trump. It's about education itself, what it should be, what it has become, and how one moment of intellectual clarity can cut through years of ideological fog. For too long, universities, once the bastions of free thought, had become battlegrounds for political agendas. Classrooms had turned into echo chambers where professors held authority not just over knowledge, but over the narrative itself. But knowledge isn't supposed to have a political alignment. Math doesn't care who you vote for. Science doesn't bend to ideology. Literature doesn't change its meaning based on social trends. And Barron Trump's moment of quiet defiance reminded an entire generation of that simple, undeniable truth. This wasn't about humiliating a professor. This wasn't about making a political statement. This was about restoring the integrity of learning. This was about proving that merit still matters. That intelligence, skill, and dedication should outweigh assumptions about privilege. That in the pursuit of knowledge, the only thing that should matter is the truth. As time passed, the university felt the ripple effects of that moment in Dr. Markham's class. More professors, perhaps learning from Markham's experience, began re-evaluating their own teaching methods. More students, inspired by Barron's quiet but unshakable confidence, began standing up for intellectual rigor in their own courses. And most importantly, more people, inside and outside the academic world, began asking the right questions. Are we teaching knowledge or teaching ideology? Are we challenging students or conditioning them? Are we pushing for true academic excellence or simply filtering education through political lenses? One moment, one classroom, one student, and the entire conversation about education changed. And that, more than any viral clip, more than any news headline, is the true power of knowledge in its purest form. So, if there's one thing to take away from this story, let it be this: education should never be about power. It should never be about politics. It should always, always, be about learning. And sometimes, it takes a single student to remind the world of that truth.